Okay, greetings everyone. Welcome to our third conversation on masculinities in Buddhism. I'd like to start first with a land acknowledgement. Today I am speaking from the traditional territories of the Seminole and the Mi'kmaq people. And the Seminole people are the descendants of many Native American tribes that suffered genocide and land displacement in colonialism in the United States. Today I have three speakers with me. Our first speaker is Bhante Sujato. He is an Australian Buddhist monk who was ordained into the Thai forest lineage of Ajahn Chah, and he is also a prolific scholar of early Buddhism. So welcome, Bhante.
G'day, Anne. How you going?
Great, thanks.
I'm here with my friend Akāliko. We're on the land of the Barramadigal people of the Darug Nation. And so we pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
Thank you. Our second speaker is Ayya Yeshe. Ayya Yeshe has been a nun for 22 years and belongs to the Mahayana forest tradition. Ayya founded the Bodhicitta Foundation in central India, working with Ambedkarite Buddhists from the Dalit community, and has a girls' home living in a slum for a decade. Ayya also has founded Bodhicitta Dakini Buddhist Monastery in Tasmania, surrounded by UNESCO World Heritage Wilderness, and is the author of Everyday Enlightenment. Welcome, Ayya Yeshe.
Thanks. Good to be here. And I'm on the land of the Palator people in Lutruwita, Tasmania, and I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging.
Thank you. Our third speaker is Bhante Akāliko. Akāliko Bhikkhu is an Australian monk in the Theravada forest tradition. He is the spiritual director of Little Dust and founder of Rain Bodhi LGBTQIA Buddhist community. Bhante Akāliko is also the spiritual advisor of Central West Buddhists and a chaplain at Western Sydney University. He sits on the boards of the Buddhist Council of New South Wales and the Federation of Australian Buddhist Councils. Welcome, Bhante Akāliko.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Anne. And I'd just also like to acknowledge the ongoing legacy of colonialism and its effect on First Nations people here and everywhere.
Thank you. So welcome everyone. I'm really excited, as I said, to start this conversation. It's part of a series of three conversations. In our first conversation, we looked at multiplicity. We looked at the multiplicity of Buddhist masculinities in classical or historic Buddhism. Our second panel discussed the ways in which toxic masculinity was showing up in contemporary Buddhism. Today, we're going to look at a kind of healthy expressions of the Dharma and look towards more positive solutions. So let's start though with a question I think that really points to why we needed to do this series. So Ayya Yeshe, could you start by telling us how has patriarchy and toxic masculinity in Buddhism impacted you?
Okay, so I'm going to speak a little bit longer, but not too long, and then I won't say too much else. Basically, you know, it's obvious to us, but maybe not obvious to some men. We're not attacking masculinity. We're addressing patriarchy, which is different to masculinity. Masculinity is not innately toxic. What is toxic is the culture of dominance. And there are a lot of good men, we all know that, and we celebrate them and we see that they're suffering and we want to help them. The problem comes about when so-called good men don't believe women or queer people or non-binary people, because they live in a world where they're at the top. And you know, unless you've actually been alone, naked, or just alone, and vulnerable with a man, and you are less strong, less educated, whatever it is, less privileged in many ways, you will not know how they behave with a vulnerable person. So they just don't believe how widespread the things that we are referring to in these panels today are. I know, like, because I've spent a lot of time on social media speaking with so-called good men who don't believe how widespread rape in Buddhism is, ritualized rape, you know, disdain, disrespect, a lack of resources, and so on. Personally, growing up, my father was a wonderful man, but when my so-called guardian died, you know, I was a street kid, and I was, you know, I'm telling my own story because I want people to understand this has happened to 1 in 3 women in your life. And if they're not telling you, they don't trust you. Okay. But it's much more widespread than you think. Like 1 in 4 girls is sexually abused as a child, 1 in 5 boys. Most of the abusers are men. And yeah, like as a street kid, I couldn't believe the kind of behavior I was seeing because none of the men in my family had behaved that way. Things like the expectation of sex in exchange for accommodation, or have sex with me and I'll protect you from other rapists. Yeah, so rape was common for a street kid. And then, like, later on, I became a Buddhist nun, and sexual harassment. There is one nunnery to every 100 monasteries in Tibetan Buddhism. And, you know, I ordained and I thought, great, I'll just be the same as everybody else, every man or whatever. And what I found was one of the lamas who ordained me, well, he didn't ordain me, he was a mentor. He told me, you need to pray to be reborn as a man. You'll never be the same as your teacher. And then having said that, he also tried to crack onto me. So then I have friends who are like, went for refuge to a lama. We all know there's huge controversies in Tibetan Buddhism with lamas, many of whom are not monastics. And like, I have a friend whose lama was using her naked pictures to bribe other lamas and manipulate them.
Wow.
That she sent this lama as a trust in a relationship, and he used those to manipulate other lamas and pass them around. And I know this, like, what we're seeing in terms of what we know about abuse is just the top of the iceberg. And nuns have less resources. You know, they're pretty much expected to do a lot of physical and emotional labor for the crime of being born a woman, like the unfortunate karma. And because men, and in many cases, we can't take full ordination, we don't receive the same amount of alms. We, you know, go last in the line behind a male novice. And there's just this kind of disdain around women's potential for enlightenment. But yeah, it's just this idea, you know, even if we, like, males kind of hold the lineage, because sometimes the female training and the female full ordination lineages died out or just weren't supported because of apathy or wars. And it's really hard to get close access to a male teacher. You can't live with them. They don't necessarily want you around because, you know, you might become attracted to them, or they might become attracted to you, or people might gossip about you. So there's just so many issues around resources. If you look in the Tibetan, this is the lineage I trained in, there is not one woman in the guru tree, or there's like one woman sitting in the Dalai Lama's entourage of 50 people. There's no female leadership. There's no female abbesses in that lineage, you know, and no way up. There's a glass ceiling. And the worst thing is this gaslighting, that it's just your negative emotions that you need to talk about these things. I mean, the second highest lama in Tibetan Buddhism got accused of raping a nun, and nobody's talking about it. They just think it's a Chinese conspiracy. They haven't even investigated it. It's like the Vatican. It's no different to the Vatican, and we just don't talk about it. And somebody who does talk about it is considered blasphemous and crazy. Yeah, it's just kind of astounding. And you know what I experience online in terms of, it's not just the growing neo-misogyny of the alt-right and the people who literally do the Nazi, you know, but it's the disdain and the disbelief of good men who think we're exaggerating. You know, and I think one modern feminist summed it up. You know, they said it's not that there aren't good men, but we're living in a time when women have done a lot to liberate themselves and from oppressive structures, and we don't need men. We choose them if they are good partners, and it's better to be alone than with someone who doesn't meet our standards. And that's often not according, you know, opposite to the alpha male dialogue. It's not about how they look or how much money they make, but it's about empathy and emotional availability and emotional labor. And now men find themselves in structures that question their privilege and don't work for them, especially like young boys in school. And instead of doing the work to grow, they try to push women back into their boxes and go back to the way things were, which is, you know, expressed in the growing neo-misogyny. So, you know, there is no support for Western, very little support. It's changing, but for nuns in Tibetan, Western nuns in Tibetan Buddhism, and even Tibetan nuns, there is a lack of support and an 85% disrobing rate within Western nuns. A lot of Asian nuns I met in the Himalayas were praying to be reborn as a man. Some nuns had been raped and thought it was their fault, so they disrobed. And yeah, like people say, why would a woman speak on positive masculinity? Well, because if we don't, 137 women are being murdered every day. And men are suffering, you know, like there's 55 million girls waiting to go to school. And there's just all these things going on that to me, it's in crisis, you know. And growing up, I was like, I know these beautiful little boys that go off to school, they love their mothers and they're affectionate, and something happens to them around socialization that turns them into something very different, you know, that disdains the feminine and I don't know, breaks them away from emotions and vulnerability. And at first I was like, are men a different species? I just don't understand them at all. I don't understand how these people that I've known and loved and grown up with have become someone completely different. And then a male friend of mine said, you know, it's bravado. It's not real. What we see as masculinity is a performance of masculinity. And that like really clicked a light for me, like, okay, so that's not masculinity. Masculinity is something very different. It's a social performance of patriarchy and what they think a man should be. And for me, that was like a real light bulb moment. And then I thought, okay, we need to return to this basic humanity, basic respect, basic emotional intelligence and well-being, and completely redefine how we're raising our children and how we're raising boys. Anyway, sorry, that's my spiel. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate, you know, you've given a very powerful first person account of the impact that toxic masculinity has had on you, and you've also set your personal experience both inside and outside of Buddhist communities in a global context. So I mean, we've really started the panel with a thought, but you also pointed to the fact that, you know, that masculinity itself is not toxic or negative, and it's a certain form of masculinity that we're really kind of, you know, inquiring into and investigating. So, you know, using that as a kind of launch pad, I'm really, you know, wanting to move us to, okay, what's some ways to go forward? So how can we understand a more positive masculinity? you know, how would we define positive masculinity, and what maybe are some specific examples of positive masculinity? I would say there's a great example right here. We've got two, you know, male, you know, bhikkhus here speaking, you know, on this topic that I find really inspiring and supportive as a woman. So I'll just, you know, open up to both of you and ask, you know, like what's the way forward? What's some good examples of positive masculinity?
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you, Ayya, for sharing your story and for pointing out the many problems that toxic masculinity has in the world and also in Buddhism. I think it is good to see two monks talking about masculinity. I think that spiritual leaders, religious leaders, have always had a role, for better or worse, in discussing gender in communities and what that gender expression looks like. And we know that Buddhism has a history of talking about, you know, the behavior of men and women. And there's some early suttas where the Buddha discusses what makes a good wife or what makes a good child and things like that. And so there's always been this conversation. And so it's only natural that we have an opportunity as spiritual leaders to give an updated version of what this might look like for men in this time. And that's taking on board a desire for things like equality and inclusion, an awareness of multiplicity, and not just caving into a very reductive view of what it means to be a man. And part of the problem in Buddhist circles is there's a fetishization of certain types of masculinity. And in the tradition that I'm affiliated with, it looks like the very hardcore ascetic, the grumpy, the unsmiling, the non-laughing, and the very dismissive of other people's feelings and emotions, because these things are to be overcome and crushed, you know. And so for us to have some monks talking about the idea that there is perhaps a different masculinity that we can cultivate and be inspired by, that's a good thing, because we don't tend to have these conversations. So I think firstly, the one way to move forward is to have a discussion more generally in our Buddhist communities about what problems are being caused by those conditionings that Ayya pointed out, and to redress that, you know. So we need to understand firstly that it's okay to talk about it, that it should be part of our conversation, and then secondly to identify the things that are not working and to identify things that would be good to cultivate. And I think this is something that you don't really see. And so I understand that there are spiritual communities where men are encouraged to really look at themselves. They tend to be like new age kind of spiritual communities, and they're encouraged to look at themselves more clearly. And those aspects of toxic masculinity are investigated, and they call it holding their feet to the fire. You know, they really want people to really examine themselves. And so this is something that perhaps we can do in a less kind of confronting way, when we investigate the things that we're supposed to be letting go of, the defilements that we let go of, the things that we want to encourage within ourselves, and see how this is not just a personal journey, but also a social journey, and also a spiritual and religious journey. And so I think that it's good to have this conversation, and I look forward to actually having this conversation with broader communities as well. I didn't give any specific examples. Bhante, do you have any specific examples of how we can be more? How it can be more?
Actually, I can say something to the topic. So the question was like about how the how we've been impacted by toxic masculinity in our lives, I do not have the very traumatizing backstory that Ayya Yeshe has, but when I was a musician, we had 2 female roadies, which was a revolution at the time. And we didn't think twice about it. And Thisbe and Lisa were hauling the PA systems and setting up the lighting rigs and all of these kinds of things. And one of the things that I learned at that time, which is one of the kind of few things I learned about sort of gender politics or whatever in that part of my life, was that everyone was fine, right? And especially the guys that they were working with were fine and there was no problem. The only problem came from management. And so there's one manager of a band that we were playing with, and he was really upset by this and, you know, started saying, oh, they can't lift the heavy things, they can't do the work. But the people they're actually working with never actually said anything like that. So that's kind of one of the things that I learned about this, is this kind of separation between the, I guess, the anxiety of having women do things is separate from the reality of the women who are actually doing those things, you know, and it's all about that. In my head, this is going to make some kind of a big problem, whereas actually the reality is it really isn't a problem. So, I mean, my kind of experience of this, of course, came through our bhikkhuni ordination. And what I found there was that all of the monks most of the monks who'd been my friends, had allegiances that were different from what I thought. And I thought that they were interested in the Buddha's teachings and the Dhamma and the Vinaya and the practice of the Buddha's teachings. And I thought that they were interested in building a community that would have a meaning and a relevance for all people, and something that would create something that would be meaningful in the future and help to actually, you know, make the world a better place and so on. I realized that none of that was really true. And their allegiance was to their notion of a Thai hierarchy. But their notion of a Thai hierarchy was also very limited and glommed on to one aspect of a hierarchy that constantly misrepresents the complexity of the actual reality of it, because the actual, if not to go over all of the details, but the leading monk who was involved in terms of the Thai hierarchy was encouraging us to do bhikkhuni ordination. And so it becomes this kind of racist imposition of sexist views that Thai monks are against it, whereas in fact Thai monks are diverse and believe all kinds of things, and some are supportive and some are not. And so there's this kind of manipulation of racial and ethnic identity to serve this kind of sexist agenda. And that caused this rift. And I think a lot of people would believe at the time that it was like, well, you know, let's, you know, it'll take time. You know, this is one of the things people saying, oh, it's too soon, it will take time. I'm like, why? I mean, the Buddha was doing it 2,500 years ago. Like, how much time do we want? Of course, all of this is just misdirection. None of this is meaningful at all. And one of the good pieces of advice I got was from Jeffrey Baumer. Is it Jeffrey Baumer? He's a colleague of Anne Halifax, actually. And we had a talk at the time. He went through the same thing with the Anglican community. And one of the things that he said was that the communities that embraced women pastors and women priests went ahead and ordained them and then just got on with life and then had women priests. And the ones that didn't are still entrenched and still fighting against it. And so that kind of, and that's exactly what's happened with us. And those who have been against it have retrenched, if anything, even further into kind of regressive and manosphere views, you know, and like secretly handing around Jordan Peterson talks in the monastery and these kinds of things, and kind of embracing these more, you know, more and more regressive kind of perspectives. And so I guess to me, the thing is that if you want to work to try to create something better, you have to work with people who are on your side, you know, and actually build something that's meaningful. And if you think that you're going to build a consensus and then make a change, then good, good luck, but that's going to take you a long time to do that. Yeah, and look, the only other thing that I've made, and I think I've made this point earlier in this series, that we talk about patriarchy as if it were an abstract thing, which it is to some extent, but patriarchy is grounded in real estate. And that's the single most important thing that we can do, is to provide from a monastic point of view, speaking of bhikkhuni ordination and supporting women's ordination, the number one thing we can do is provide land, provide real estate for bhikkhunis to actually live on. And that's the actual seat of the power, not, we think it's some mystical thing or some teaching lineage and all of these kinds of things, but it's actually the fact of ownership and control of real estate. And that is the major source of power.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was really great to have the broader perspective of what we need to do, which what I was hearing was essentially consciousness raising, like starting to talk about the issue of masculinity, to normalize conversations about masculinity, and through those conversations to kind of identify the problems and the ways to move forward. And then the more specific examples of your pre-Buddhist life as a musician, and ways in which you experience challenging the kind of patriarchy, and then your work to support the bhikkhuni ordination, which I know has been really supportive and inspiring for so many Buddhist women. Ayya Yeshe, I'm curious just to bring you in onto this kind of note. What's your experience of positive masculinity? Like, in what ways have you felt or have seen support from kind of brothers in the Dharma?
Well, the two brothers sitting here are a great example, but maybe we should first define positive masculinity, right? Which is connected, emotionally open, working for the greater good, the mature masculine archetypes, connected to themselves and others, open communication, non-violence, authenticity to one's values, able to process emotions and ask for help, able to be emotionally vulnerable, and committed to being their authentic selves rather than a regressive and restrictive straitjacket of machismo that is unhealthy. Yeah. So what can I say? Bhante Sujato has been very supportive of me, and he actually really opened my eyes. He was radical before I was. Like, in the beginning, I was a really orthodox nun, and I was like, why do we need full ordination? We'll just get enlightened. We don't need to worry about politics and these worldly things. And then I just started to feel the glass ceiling. I started to feel suffocated. And I realized I'd been bypassing a whole bunch of trauma around why I felt frustrated and, the glass ceiling. And as the years have gone by, like, I've just really seen a real shadow side. And all through this, Bhante Sujato, Ajahn Brahm, Thich Nhat Hanh, they've stood up for women. And there's a really nice German monk who runs a site that speaks about cultish abuse in Buddhism.
His name is Tenzin Pelgyur. Tenzin Pelgyur.
Yeah.
To Amy and I.
Yeah, he's also been really impressive, and like Raymond Lamb at Buddhist Door. Just, and really sometimes it's just the laymen who believe you, and are not like, you're crazy. How can you possibly say this? But when I think of archetypes, I think of Ananda, who when Mahaprajapati came to the Buddha and said, there's many Shakyan women here who want to be ordained. And the Buddha was like, I don't think we can do that because we're living under trees. And Nanda was like, she's cared for you and she loves you. And, are you telling me women can't get enlightened, who made the Buddha think twice and was constantly the advocate for women. And also like King Pasenadi, who was really he was like he wasn't the dominator in the relationship, in the great love story he had with his wife Queen Malika, I think that was her name. And then, you know, monks like Shariputra, you know, and you know, those who speak of compassion. I mean, I don't know the personal life of Shantideva, I mean. I don't know the personal life of Shantideva, but I know he wasn't about keeping up a facade. I know he was accused of being a lazy monk, and then he gave this amazing exposition on compassion. So I draw inspiration from all of those people. And, you know, look, the Dalai Lama, he's made some mistakes. He hasn't signed the anti-abuse survey from the Western teachers group, but he has done a lot for Western nuns, for Tibetan nuns and their education, and pushing forward the Geshe-ma degree. And he does, you know, give them funds and has helped start a lot of nunneries. So, I mean, he's made mistakes, but I think he's also done good things too.
Mm.
But I think Aragorn from Lord of the Rings is a really good example of positive masculinity as well.
Oh, I'm not. Yes, yeah, I think I agree with you. I'm struck by, you know, you mentioned Ananda. I think, you know, I think it's great to think of him as the first kind of feminist ally in Buddhism, very beloved to a lot of Buddhist women. I'm also kind of, you know, you kind of started to draw on some more classical Buddhist teachers and teachings that you feel kind of supportive of positive masculinity. I know this is something of interest to both Bhantes, of, you know, what Buddhist teachings, you know, what suttas kind of encourage the development of qualities that we might associate with positive masculinity. So maybe this is an opportunity to kind of geek out on the kind of Buddhist resources that we've got for positive masculinity.
You know, one of the things that always impresses me about Ananda is that he cries. And so we've in several places that he cries, and I think this is very beautiful, and that's that emotionally connected and authentic being. You know, he got in trouble for it, of course, from the uber masculine monks, but you know, he cried, and so I think this is something that's very beautiful. One of the other things that the Buddha often talked about when he was talking about social harmony was, do you regard each other with eyes of love, with eyes of affection? And this is also something very beautiful, because toxic masculinity is about competition, about getting ahead, about being the alpha, about subduing and dominating. Whereas this is about, you know, caring for each other. And we see this throughout the suttas. And even Venerable Yeshe just mentioned Sariputta, and the Buddha describes Sariputta as the mother. Is that right? Who leads, raises the monks and gets them to a certain stage of development.
But the birth mother, Sariputta's the birth mother, yeah.
Yeah, and then Moggallana is the nurse who takes them further to arahantship. And I think these are caring qualities that the Buddha is pointing to, that men have a responsibility to encourage the best within within that gender, with each other. And you see this in many monasteries around the world, especially in Asian countries, where the monks look after each other, they care for each other, they have a culture which is a more positive form of masculinity. And I think sometimes when I look at Western monastic communities, perhaps because of a fear based in homophobia, there's less conspicuous caring, less conspicuous tenderness between these men. And so those environments become a bit more brittle and harsh. bit more competitive. And I think for many men who step into these spaces, that is the change within themselves. They move from a world where they accept having a female boss, where they accept things like equality, and then if they step into some of these monastic communities where there is a problem with masculinity within that community itself, then that's how that change occurs. In otherwise good men, nice men, they have to take on the culture of that place. And it is a cultural thing. And this is something that I saw myself in communities that I've lived in, that men who come from the outside world of contemporary equality for women and acceptance of, anyway, what I see is people coming into those spaces and having to take on a less equal attitude towards women. They become that hierarchy that Bhante Sujato just mentioned is imposed on them. They become a part of that. And because when people come into a monastery, they're often at the lowest level of hierarchy, then they're looking for someone to subjugate, and that's often the women. And this is how that process occurs. And so I've seen that happen. And so unless we talk about these different positive role models, then we're not going to create cultural change, because we just got to keep imposing these less healthy models in our communities. So that's why I think it's important to discuss and to challenge. But I've seen, actually, one thing that really inspires me is that there's a lot of men who come into those spaces and question what's going on and have a problem with that process that I just outlined. And there's a lot of men that I know who really love hearing from female teachers, who love being around women practitioners, who don't have this cultural attitude. And so I see that a lot, and I think that we should encourage more of that, within our communities. So less isolation from women and more togetherness, I think, would be really healthy.
Oh no, that's brilliant. I really appreciate, several things that you've said. I just want to amplify. I really wanted to amplify that you talked about alternative masculinities, more caring and tender masculinities in Asia, because I often, find a rhetoric in Western Buddhism, especially white dominant Western Buddhism, that the patriarchy is just like an Asian problem. So you find that patriarchy becomes racialized as well. So I really appreciate you kind of, destabilizing that, really problematic racialized binary. Another point that, I think is really important to just echo for, our listeners is, the impact structures have on individuals, and how oppressive and dominant structures, can really draw out oppressive and dominant qualities in individuals. They kind of assimilate into the dominant structure. But then, of course, the flip side of that is that if we create different types of cultures, we can kind of cultivate kind of more tender, softer, kind of friendlier kind of qualities in men. So I just really appreciated the kind of multiplicity that you kind of expressed, and just wanted to highlight.
Thank you, Anne, for putting it in much better way than what I did. So
No, not at all.
Yes, I agree.
I just wanted to echo, because I was really loving what you were saying, and have just come off, an institute on Buddhism and women, where I really actually struggled with a couple of male participants. And so, like, for me, it's a balm to hear men talk in this way. I think that's what Ayya Yeshe was saying as well. Like, it means so much to us as Buddhist women to hear Buddhist men who want to overcome patriarchy as well, and just the solidarity of, being together. So,
and I think that's why it's so important to actually have these discussions, because one thing I realized is that in the absence of these discussions, some people might see that this isn't something we're thinking about or care about. So, you know, by being silent, by not discussing it, it actually helps promote a view that perhaps isn't representative. And I know so many monks and so many lay Buddhists and so many men who actually do care about, you know, equality, inclusiveness. And unless we kind of really promote these views, then for some reason that dominant paradigm is just going to perpetuate itself over and over again. So yes, I think it's really healthy to actually have these conversations.
Oh, me too.
Well, what you said, Venerable, remind me of actually just like exactly that just happened when I was in Indonesia. And I stayed for a little while at a monastery there. It's one of the few places in Indonesia where they support bhikkhunis. So, you know, a few visiting monks and so on coming along there. I didn't really know the people there or anything when we arrived. So there's one junior monk there, and when we got there, he's like, he wanted to offer me a foot massage. And I'm like, typical me, I'm like, oh no, my feet are fine, that's all right. And he did it like a couple of times during the time, and then I got to know him over a couple of days. And then I realized that actually he really looked up to me. It's not something that I thought of when we went there. I just thought, oh, you know, it's just another monk. But then I realized, oh, you know, he'd been like reading my translations or something, and he really looked up to me. And he probably had kind of a bit of kind of low self-esteem and felt that he didn't have anything to contribute. And so then this was his way of saying that he could actually do something to nice for his teacher or something like that. And so eventually my barriers broke down, and I let it then he gave me a nice foot massage. Yeah, and that kind of connection, I think, is you know, it's really kind of beautiful, and it's really sweet, and you know, it is very much a part of monastic culture, certainly throughout Asia. But one thing I also wanted to say, just to respond to what you said earlier, you know, you talked about how men, when they come into the monastery, are acculturated to a certain kind of point of view, which of course can happen. But the kind of the flip side of it also is that once you have that culture, you then tend to attract men who are liable to see things from that perspective, right? So kids who have whatever mummy issues or whatever, have issues with women, come to a monastery so they can kind of escape those kinds of things. And that's also another kind of driver of these things.
Yeah, that's so true. Great. So move on to the next question. So I'm curious to hear some visions of what a Buddhism that was fully inclusive of women and transgender people and non-binary people would look like. What's some kind of visions for present and future?
I can just point to my recent experience. I was up in Cairns just recently giving some meditation retreats. 98% of the participants were women. And this is my experience of Buddhism around the world. You know, there's so many women who are a fundamental part of Buddhist communities, and the Buddhist communities really exist purely because of the support of women and the participation of women at so many levels of the system, but they seem to be excluded from, you know, those positions of power and getting to the top of the hierarchy. And so when I saw this the other day, you know, I was like, and I was aware of these questions in advance. I was like, you know, we're already, you know, we've got this inclusion. It's just we don't have any value, you know, of the potential for women to be at that hierarchy top level, and to make those women, you know, empowered and have a sense of authority and all of that. So yeah, so I was like, yeah, there's so many women and also so many queer people also involved in Buddhism, and they tend to bring a different kind of masculinity. It's not perfect, of course, because in queer communities too, there's a fetishization of certain types of masculinity, and also within trans communities too. Sometimes the most toxic, because they're the most conspicuous forms of masculinity, are those taken on by, deliberately taken on by trans people. So the idea that we're not inclusive is really about where we value. And when I see the amount of work done by women lay supporters to look after the communities, then, you know, I see that it's not valued as it should be, or the people who are involved in organizing and promoting and all of these stages that allow someone like me to come along and do a program. It's really women who do that work, and it's something that really makes me question my own privilege within that system, and ask myself how I can value that more, how I can talk about that more, so that even if there's different work being done, that it's valued in a way that is better. But for me, a more inclusive Buddhism is obviously going to be dismantling that glass ceiling, dismantling those power structures that prevent women from being at the top. And it means listening to women teachers, and having women at all levels. And that means, you know, in organizations like the Buddhist councils, the various hierarchical models that we have in Australia and overseas, having women and listening to women, valuing women. So yeah.
Ayya Yeshe, did you have something?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's part of it is doing the inner work of addressing and undoing the violent socialization of young men and making them question that and their assumptions about women owing them beauty, politeness, thinness, sex, you know, and that sense of expectation that when men perform toxic masculinity, women perform toxic femininity, which is let me serve you, let me be demure, let me not speak up about what I really feel and need, let me not be angry, which is very present in Buddhism. Toxic femininity is very present in Buddhism. And I think it's also about creating safe spaces where teachers don't sleep with their students, where sex is not ritualized into some kind of enlightenment procedure, which is quite disturbing to me, that happens sometimes within Vajrayana communities, where young monastics are not molested. So a lot of education around consent and around ethics and around non-harm, because a lot of these things happen because men have been severed from their own emotional well-being and vulnerability, because it's only when you've been severed from your own emotional well-being and vulnerability that you can commit acts of violence and harm. And that you dehumanize someone else and don't see them as equal to you. And that violence is enacted by patriarchy on both men and women. So I think not supporting centers where only men lead, and to be honest, that would be a lot of Tibetan Buddhist centers, like where men are just at the top directing everything and they receive all the resources. I mean, in the majority of Tibetan Buddhist centers in the West, women do most of the labor, but Western nuns are not paid, they're not housed, they're not offered robes, they're not offered education, and they burn out and disrobe and lose faith because they're not given the same respect or authority or access to resources as men. And people say, well, you're supposed to be a Buddhist nun. Why would you want power? Aren't you supposed to be losing your ego? Why are you always complaining? Aren't you supposed to be free of desire? Why are you angry? You're not supposed to have feelings. And it's like, actually, you may think that you're offering me good Buddhist advice, but really you're gaslighting me for being human, for having basic needs, for asking to be treated with basic respect and safety. So we need to question all of those things about what we expect from Buddhist nuns, why we expect them to be endlessly giving and never complain. I mean, that in itself is toxic femininity, that we expect women to be submissive. And you'll see, it's interesting, in yoga circles, there's this growing teachings on polarity, gender polarity, which is this some version of the sacred feminine and masculine coming from Jungian archetypes, which in itself is not bad, but the polarity teachings specifically are, it's like the alt-right way to hook men and women back into traditional oppressive gender roles of like, you're in your feminine, so submit, and I'm in my masculine, so I'll lead. But then you peel back further of these spiritual teachings and it's like, oh, okay, so, you know, it's toxic masculinity or patriarchy at the bottom of it, you know? So like breaking down those, just not being led down that path of playing those roles, you know. I'm not saying abandoning, I mean, in the queer community, people like to talk about abandoning gender roles or, gender bending, and that's, I support that, but I also think it's maybe not realistic for the majority of people who are cisgender, hetero, and still feel cisgender. So we need to first abandon toxic versions of our gender before we completely dispense with gender.
So thank you. It's quite interesting, you know, you mentioned the word toxic femininity. I noticed I kind of contracted a little bit, just that little automatic contraction. But I was recently reading on Twitter, Fount of All Knowledge, a commentary on moving from the term toxic masculinity to toxic patriarchy, because the argument was that toxic patriarchy recognizes that all forms of gender conditioning, toxic masculinity, toxic femininity, even, you know, in LGBTQI populations that Bhante Akāliko had mentioned, you know, can become quite, you know, distorted and kind of extreme versions of themselves. So I think this is, you know, it's quite helpful in a way, because it points to the harm that patriarchy as the ultimate system of harm kind of, you know, can do on all types of gender populations. I did want to say, you know, I think transgender populations right now are the most vulnerable gender populations. So I think, you know, when we're critiquing, you know, or looking at gender or, you know, other things in the trans community, that we, you know, want to also acknowledge that they are a population under real attack right now. And also a population that are also fighting for inclusion in, you know, Buddhist communities. I know that a transgender monk was denied entry in a Theravada tradition in the US, for example. So it's quite complex, but I think, you know, the point that I'm really hearing is, you know, toxic patriarchy damages all genders. Either because we enact it ourselves, we kind of take it on and kind of act it out, or we are acted upon by it, you know, we are oppressed by it. So I really appreciate, you know, just the scope of the harm, really, and the, you know, the scope of the problem that we have to kind of take on here. I'm curious from the Bhantes if either of you, you know, have any, you know, kind of thoughts on, you know, kind of how, you know, the transgender ordination debate, or anything to add in that area, if you've seen any kind of movement or anything there.
Yeah, so one of the things that I did a little while ago was in response to quite a few inquiries actually to me through my work with Rainbirdy, was people looking for ordination who are trans and wanting to find out if it was possible and wanting pathways into ordination. And so I helped connect trans masc Buddhists and trans femme Buddhists from around the world with supportive community and set up a trans ordination working party. It's important to acknowledge the difference between the different transgender communities in terms of access to full ordination, because of various things in the veneer, and I guess various attitudes from communities. But they took it to a level, I think, where they developed resources and they developed a supportive online community. And so I didn't have anything to do, want the trans community to organize themselves and to feel safe to talk about these issues themselves. But they have an ongoing community where they come together and support each other. And there has actually been some progress, and there has actually been some senior monks saying that they would ordain some trans masc guys. Unfortunately, there is some conversation still around what's in people's underwear and things like that. So I think the conversation has a long way to go still, and I just hope that in the future, people who wish to ordain can ordain, and that Buddhist communities will be as supportive as possible. And yeah, so that's kind of where that is. But so just so people, if they are trans and they're looking for ordination, just know that there is a bunch of people out there like you, and that there is a working party that comes together and meets. And so you can contact me through Rainbirdie if you want to be connected with those people.
That's fantastic. And I'd asked you earlier, what's a contemporary example of positive masculinity? I think that's a contemporary example of positive masculinity, that you're doing that work and helping put people in touch with people that, move it forward. So just want to affirm that as an example of what I would see as positive masculinity in the present. Okay, so we're coming to an end of our conversation. I guess I always like to kind of end with an open question, like what's not being asked that you want to, you want listeners to hear? What might have we missed in the conversation so far?
I'll tell a short story from just my recent experience traveling in Indonesia, and I'll just share this because I think probably most of the people listening to this will end up being from the US or whatever, and perceptions of Buddhism in Asia sort of tend to be filtered through a lot of presuppositions. Anyway, just in Jakarta and doing some teaching and things like that, one of the things that they asked me about a few times was, and the term they used was, what about LGBT, right? Which already is kind of interesting, right? Because if I'd been there, say, 10 years ago, they wouldn't have framed it like that, right? This is a kind of a Western acronym which has got popular, and it's showing how they're kind of responding it to through a lens that they've heard from other people. Of course, Indonesia being, 90 plus something % Muslim country, where there has been recent attacks and suppression of the queer community in various ways. I'm not that familiar with it, but which also has a kind of a history of normalizing of diverse gender roles in different kind of ways through culturally. Anyway, they kind of asked me about this, and my kind of, one of the things, I always give a kind of, I'm not going to kind of sugarcoat it for a particular environment or something like that. Actually, a few years ago, they asked about same-sex marriage, and I said, if queer people can't get married in Indonesia, then just come to Perth and we'll do it. And the same thing, they asked me about this, and I said, well, look, Buddhism shouldn't be the kind of religion that spends all of its time worrying about what other people are doing in their bedroom. And we shouldn't be the kind of weirdos who have got nothing better to do with our life than to just fixate on people's sexuality and so on, as if that's kind of defining who they are. That's an aspect of who people are, but we're human beings, and what we should be focusing on is having compassion for people who are vulnerable and people who are suffering. And people who come into a Buddhist temple are people who have experienced suffering in their lives, and we should be focused on accepting those and treating everybody as human beings. So anyway, this is a kind of conversation that we had in Jakarta. I don't know, it seemed to be reasonably well accepted. I'm sure some people are going to disagree or whatever. I don't expect everyone's going to agree to it. But I just wanted to sort of just pass that on, just to say that, well, these kinds of conversations are happening in spaces that aren't, necessarily what you think. And also just to say, it was their question. I wasn't going there and pushing an agenda or anything, but, I'll give an honest answer when they ask me.
It's a great story. Thanks.
It's good to know that there are already a few trans people who are ordained and non-binary people, even though they may have taken not an easy way to get there. But certainly there are people, including myself and Bhante Sujato and Bhante Akāliko, and who are looking at ways to make access more easy, because we don't want to be part of a sangha where people are excluded, because we know what exclusion feels like. And that's the thing, like, I think we all have a lot of healing to do in terms of addressing the emotional harm done to men by patriarchy, because to be an oppressor hurts. Eventually it hurts. And the harm perpetuated and done by both, the privileged and the not so privileged, and to be against violence and to follow the Dharma is to really stand with the vulnerable. And that includes anyone who is marginalized. That is why, all these issues are interconnected: poverty, racism, sexism, homophobia. All of these issues are connected. And that's why, the oppression of any minority is a stain, especially within Buddhism, is a stain on the compassion and ideal of awakening that all beings possess.
Thank you. Really struck by that kind of empathy of your expression of feeling for other marginalized beings, and kind of knowing that pain yourself as a marginalized being. It's really kind of powerful if you can move from that to empathy and compassion.
So we need to create sanghas where we support that. Sorry, go ahead.
Please finish what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, we need to stop giving our power away to centers and lineages that don't support those things, and we need to start working together, those of us who do support those things, to make change. To withdraw our support from centers that don't support women, that don't support queer people, that don't support trans people or poor people. And we need to work to create solidarity to bring about the change we want to see, rather than waiting for those in power to change, because while they have the power, they won't change. They're enjoying their power too much to change.
Exactly, yeah.
Sorry, Bhante.
So Anne, you asked before if there was anything that we might have left out, and I just think there's so much actually that we've left out, especially those things that I was just pointing to in terms of intersectionality. And there's so many things that have popped into my head while I've been listening to our other speakers. And so I've said it a couple of times, but I just think these conversations need to happen more, and with the right people. And to express once again that there are people out there having these conversations, but it's kind of like on the sidelines or in private, and to point out once again that Buddhism does have a role in creating healthy communities. And so that these conversations are not about identity politics, or being PC. This is about helping people to be good and to create communities of individuals who don't harm themselves or others. And this is very much in keeping with being Buddhist. We follow these teachings, and so we've got to look out for opportunities to link those two things in people's minds, that our spiritual journey is linked to the well-being of women, the well-being of men, the well-being of boys and girls, non-binary people everywhere. And this is a conversation that is legitimate and we should have more often.
Mm.
And we can't have peace if there's a whole bunch of oppression and suffering we're ignoring, and a whole bunch of people who can't even get into the shrine room because they're too busy, you know, making lunch or cleaning the floor, or you know, because they're not valued.
Mm.
You know, we can't have that. We can't really call that the noble sangha if we're creating ill will and exclusion and harm. If our privilege is built on the suffering of others, you know, for the welfare of the many, isn't it?
Mm. Well, I think that's a really powerful place to end. I've really enjoyed speaking with you all tonight. And yeah, just want to, you know, thank you for being, you know, reaching out and wanting to talk about this, you know, this topic, which I also agree is so important. And hopefully, you know, we hope the series will be for the benefit of all. So take care, everyone.
Thank
So
you.
thank you, Anne, so much for hosting us and, you know, pulling us all together.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Mm.